our next session today, which is our workshop on loneliness and social isolation. And I'm going to bring in now Dr. Jill Gover, a Ph.D. licensed clinical psychologist and behavioral health manager at Desert AIDS Project. Now, prior to joining DAP, you may know her work for many years as the mental health director at the Scott Hines Mental Health Clinic at the Center. That's where she developed, established, and supervised outpatient mental health services. In addition to her many other responsibilities at the center, she provided individual, couples, family, group therapy for the LGBTQ community. Dr. Gover has also provided psychological services to students on campus at College of the Desert. She has also worked at numerous other organizations and also in private practice. So Dr. Gover, we look forward to your presentation this morning, and I'll turn it over to you. Good morning.
Good morning. First of all, I want to say hi to everyone, and I'm not seeing the gallery yet, but my plan is to do a short presentation with a PowerPoint, and then to do a little bit of an interactive conversation, somewhat similar to what Greg did when we started off, so that I can see all your faces and say hi to all of you. I see many of my friends and colleagues and fellow activists out there in the gallery. And I wanted to say hi and a great shout out to Greg for getting us started today. It was so wonderful to hear him again and to hear his enthusiasm and to talk about community, which you'll hear me saying over and over again. So I am going to take my video off so that I can bring on my slideshow. Hopefully the technology will cooperate. And you can all turn off your videos as well. But then when we get to the end of the slideshow, I'm going to have everybody turn on their video so we can have a conversation. So cross fingers that I can make this work. That's the challenges of technology. What I'm going to be doing is looking at a different screen, so you're not going to see my face because I have to look away from the camera. But you're going to be looking at the slideshow anyway. So good, we're ready to go. I wanted to start off with just a couple of stats from the research on older adults living with HIV study. There was an original study, and then there was a second follow-up study, ROA 2.0, in 2018. And almost half of the respondents reported feeling lonely or very lonely in this study, about 43%. And 70% were living alone, compared to about 30% of the general population. So right here we can see, and this was in 2018, that this has been a huge problem. It's a huge problem for older adults in general, but it's particularly challenging for older adults who are aging with HIV. And we know from numerous studies that there's a link between isolation and loneliness to an increased risk of stroke, heart disease, high blood pressure, and an earlier onset of dementia. We know that isolation will increase stress hormones, particularly cortisol, and cause inflammation. And of course, inflammation is the last thing you want when you're living with HIV. One of the researchers stated, and this is the quote, "Feeling isolated may be as bad for a person's health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day." So this is a huge problem. And it's not just a mental health problem, it's also a physical health problem. But there's some very good reasons why older adults living with HIV are so likely, had such a high prevalence rate for loneliness and social isolation. And as Greg started off and reminded us, losing an entire social circle of friends to AIDS in the 1980s, at a time when most of us were in our 20s and 30s. That's not developmentally a time when you expect to lose an entire social network. That's more what happens in perhaps a natural catastrophe or a war, right? Which is why we often think about the trauma associated with that time period the way we think about people who are war veterans and have trauma. Very, very traumatic time period for all of us who remember it. And on top of people dying in droves, those who were diagnosed were ostracized, stigmatized, and blamed for the AIDS epidemic. There was a societal indifference and a rejection at the same time that people were dealing with their own death, possible death, right? So given this history of multiple losses and the residual psychological scars from past discrimination, it's more difficult now to develop meaningful connections. And Ray alluded to this earlier. As we age, it's more difficult to form new relationships, just in general. People aren't as open to new relationships, and I think part of it too is that for heterosexuals, there is more of a tendency to go back to biological family, to spend time with children and grandchildren, and less time that's spent with friends. So as people age, their peer group dies, and that includes partners. And so many older adults find themselves alone. And remember that long-term survivors are more likely to be aging without children, which means without grandchildren, without a younger generation of biological relatives who are caring for them. And that's an important issue. So there are many good reasons why there's a higher prevalence of loneliness and social isolation. I want to talk about two types of loneliness. There's an emotional loneliness and a social loneliness. Emotional loneliness is defined as the absence of a significant other with whom a close attachment is formed, typically a spouse, partner. And what's needed to ameliorate emotional loneliness is to develop a quality, intimate relationship. And that relationship may or may not have a sexual component, but the key is that it's an intimate relationship. And it doesn't need to have quantity, it's quality. Social loneliness is defined as the lack of a wider social network of friends and neighbors and colleagues. And what's needed to address social loneliness is to engage in more shared activities with others in order to build a network, to build a community. And this will be sort of the theme of my talk today. This is sort of it in a nutshell. Connection, which is how we establish that intimacy, and community are the antidotes to loneliness, isolation, and depression. These are the two most important pieces to counteract loneliness and social isolation. I want to talk for a moment about social supports in later life. Social supports are crucial to both physical and mental well-being for people of all ages, but they're especially important as we grow older because we are going to be challenged with multiple chronic illnesses. So we need a large social support to help us with these challenges. The average comorbidity for older adults living with HIV is over three comorbidities. If the informal caregiver provided by family and friends and neighbors were replaced by official paid caregivers, the cost would exceed $470 billion annually. That came out of an AARP report. So social networks are a critical healthcare resource as well. We absolutely need our friends and family to help care for us as we age. The ROAS study that I referenced before, that was spearheaded by Dr. Brennan Ng and Dr. Karpiak, they did a very interesting analysis where they examined the respondents and categorized the social network types. And they had a roughly third in their study. 1/3, 32%, they categorized in the as isolated. And this was defined as people who had very little contact with adult children, little contact with other family members or friends, little interaction with a faith community, and the most isolated of the three categories. The second category is friend-centered. There were about 35 respondents who fell into that category. They had contacts with friends, they had a good social peer support, but not with children or biological family or faith-based groups. And then the last category was 33% of the respondents had the broadest spectrum of relationships in their social support network. They had adult children, they had other family, they had families of choice, they had friendships and acquaintances, and they had the highest levels of participation in faith-based communities. And then they looked at, and I'm just pulling out one piece of their research, they looked at the UCLA loneliness scale, and 47% in the isolated category endorsed that scale versus 41% in the integrated category. So what we took from this study is that the friend-centered, the amount of assistance received from friends didn't compensate from the lack of a biological family support. And what was stated in this research was that biological family or legal family tend to be more likely to be engaged in assisting with activities of daily living, ADLs, than just friends. And the isolated reported significantly lower levels of assistance, lower perceptions of support, greater stigma, greater psychological distress, and a just lower overall well-being as compared to their peers. So, and we see this reflected in the loneliness scale. There's almost a 10% difference there, even though overall people were still feeling isolated and lonely. I mean, still look at that too. So some of the very key findings from that research, along with several pieces of research that I've cited here. These are kind of the big takeaways around social isolation and loneliness among older adults living with HIV. There are more fragile networks, and they're characterized by heavier reliance on friends or families of choice as opposed to biological or legal family. Older adults living with HIV have high levels of comorbid physical and mental health issues. As I mentioned before, the average comorbidity is 3.4. Older adults living with HIV do not receive adequate support from their social networks in general, just overall. And they have trouble coping with the demands of illness management, keeping medical appointments, adhering to treatment. When social supports are available, there are lower levels of psychological distress and higher levels of well-being. So developing a large and robust social support network is really key to aging well, to healthy aging. I know Jeff is going to talk about this much more in depth later on, but I just wanted to mention the recent study that was done in Coachella Valley with HARP-PS, USC, and UCR in a wonderful partnership to look in Coachella Valley the impact that COVID had on older adults living with HIV. And the big takeaway here for this just one little piece of isolation is that participants reported a mean of 6.3 in terms of feeling socially isolated on a scale of 1 to 10. And almost half, 41%, reported in the upper range of 8 to 10. So definitely this points to, is indicative of the increased sense of isolation that COVID has brought. People were already feeling lonely and isolated, and COVID has just exacerbated that. So I hope that I have convinced you at this point that it's a serious problem and something that we need to do some very specific things to ameliorate. And I have 10 suggestions. How are we going to cultivate connection during this period of isolation? This is challenging. Oh, something just went on my screen. I hope that didn't go on your screen. So number one is it's really helpful to improve your communication skills. Being able to listen, to be able to express what you're feeling without attacking other people, being able to tune into and develop and hone your empathy skills. These are all going to be very helpful in cultivating connection. And you can talk to volunteer listeners on a helpline. When we need to talk, it's important that we have someone who can listen. And I'm going to also suggest that for those who are really working on their communication skills, it's also wonderful to be a listener. And to volunteer to work on a helpline will benefit both you and others. And what we find from a lot of different research is that those people who are engaged in altruistic activities and volunteer activities, helping other people, boost their own immune system and improve their own mental health, as well as helping others. So it's a win-win situation. The other thing that you can do to cultivate connection is to engage in the conversation menu, and I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. And you can use the conversation menu to develop or deepen relationships. You can schedule video chat catch-ups with friends whom you haven't spoken to in a while. This is a great time to reach out to people you've lost touch with and reconnect with new bonds. You can use video chat apps to play games and have like game night. A lot of people like the app House Party. You can have a virtual happy hour over a video chat. Or you can go to meetups. Meetup.com has lots of events, and recently a lot of events have transferred over to Zoom. So it's things that you can do. You can find new friends through shared activities and interests through the meetup groups. Or organize a weekly lunch date with a friend so that you have a special time that the two of you get together and catch up and chat and have lunch together. Something that you might have done before COVID, going over to coffee and meeting at the corridor, continue to do that. You can use the technology to stay connected. We may have to be physically distant right now, but we do not have to be isolated. And I think that's a very important distinction. You can use the Netflix party extension to watch movies with your friends online. That's a fun thing to do. And then my favorite one personally is to send a letter to a loved one. This is a really great time to express appreciation and love and gratitude to the important people in your life. And everybody loves getting a card or a letter. And I know when I receive cards, I really cherish them. And when I send them, I know that the people who receive them really appreciate them. And it helps to connect and deepen the bond. This is all ways that we cultivate connection and can continue to do so even through this time of isolation. So let me talk about the conversation menu. There are starters, a main course, and dessert. And these are some great questions that you can use to either start off a conversation or deepen it. If you have a weekly kind of check-in with your buddies, the starters are a great way to kind of start it off. What's been the highlight of your week so far? What are you enjoying about life at the moment? What are you looking forward to in the future? The main entree, if you want to dig a little deeper, do you have any goals you're working towards right now? What's a personal challenge or obstacle you're currently facing? Have you had any interesting insights about yourself recently? Or the dessert, sort of the little cherry on the icing on the cake. What's the most interesting thing that you've read or learned about recently? And this is a really good time to try something new, learn something new, and then talk to somebody about it. And what would you like to learn more about in the future? These are great questions to start conversations and deepen connection. I'm also going to share with you my little daily quarantine checklist. I think that this is a really helpful set of questions to ask oneself as sort of a checklist to make sure you're doing these things on a daily basis so that you don't let physical isolation become social isolation. And the very first question on the daily quarantine checklist is, who am I checking in with or connecting with today? Make that be a very conscious effort. What expectations of normal am I letting go of today? Well, I will just share with all of you my expectation of being seamless and professional in my delivery of my presentation as I might have been if we were face-to-face before COVID. I had to let go of that expectation because the Zoom world is still challenging for me as an older adult. I am challenged by technology, but I always say that as older adults, it may take us a little bit longer to learn, but we'll get there. We will get there. We will be able to do this. But I have to let go of that as being my expectation of normal. And so that's just an example. All of us have to let go of something right now because we're not living in normal times, obviously. When am I going outside today for at least 15 minutes? As we heard earlier, vitamin D is important. Get that sunshine, get that natural fresh air. It's important. It's important for your mental well-being. How am I going to move my body today? It is so essential to keep moving. For healthy aging in general, we absolutely cannot be couch potatoes. We've got to move our bodies. It's critical. What am I going to do to express my creativity? There are so many different ways that we can be creative right now. And think about self-care. What am I doing to nourish myself? And the last one, which is not showing on here, is what am I grateful for today? And that is very important for keeping us focused on all of our blessings and the miracle that we are still here today. So in summary, what I'd say is there are 3 different ways that we can overcome isolation and loneliness. First, don't underestimate the power of intentional socializing. So join a club, a meetup group, a support group. Find ways to intentionally socialize, engage in a fun activity that's shared with others. Okay? It's not going to happen as easily in a spontaneous way during this pandemic, but we can intentionally make time to socialize, and that's very important to do that. The power of empathy and compassion. We need to put ourselves in other people's shoes and join with them and imagine life through their lens, through their perspective. And it's really important to reach out to others who might be isolated, because if you're feeling isolated, there are others out there who are also feeling isolated. And when you make that connection, you help yourself and you help them. And then the power of scheduling connection time. And this also is about intentionalizing your social time, which is plan one-on-one visits, either virtually or outdoors with social distancing, but quality connections, one-on-one time for conversation starters menu. I'm going to end with a wonderful quote from one of my favorite psychologists, Brené Brown. And I believe this to be true. Connection is why we're here. We are hardwired to connect with others. It's in our DNA. It's what gives purpose and meaning to our lives. And without it, there is suffering. It's so important for us to stay connected during this time of physical isolation. Remember, that doesn't mean that we stay socially isolated. We still need to connect. And I want to just end with my shout out to therapy. It's my campaign to eliminate stigma around seeking therapy. It's so important that we recognize the importance of this resource and take advantage of it. And I like to say, therapy is a gift we give ourselves to promote our well-being in times of stress. And right now, everybody can benefit from therapy. And a therapist can really assist in identifying specifically what strategies will be most beneficial for you in order to overcome loneliness and social isolation. And that is the end. And I'm going to stop my share there and move my screen to the gallery so I can see all of you and you can see me again. And I'm waving to Nicholas. Good to see all of you. Just like Craig, it's just wonderful to see everybody. And what I'd like to do now is, it's an experiment. We'll see how this works on Zoom. I want to hear from you. And I want to hear your questions, your comments. And I'm going to pose a question for you that I would love you to share as we share with each other. And the question is, what are you doing to overcome loneliness and social isolation? What's working for you? And how we'll do this is Jeff is going to tell you how to do the raise your hand thing in the Zoom chat, and then he'll unmute you and we'll be able to talk together. So Jeff, can you do that?
Yeah, thanks, Jill. I just put that in the chat box there. But if you click on participants, and then there should be under the list of people, you'll see an option for raise your hand. And you can do that. And if that doesn't work, that's why we have our videos on. You can just go like this, keep your hand up, and I'll find you and let you know that you're up next and put it in chat. So yeah, I see a couple of hands up. Matt Sharp.
Oh, great. Wonderful, Matt. So good to see you here.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
It's so great to see you, Jill. I love you so much. It's great to see everybody. And I just want to chime in on the loneliness thing. You know, I've been living alone, or I was living alone for so long. And I made a decision. I got a really great opportunity to move in with somebody. I got into a house, and I needed a roommate. And so I'm now living with a friend of mine I've known for years who's on the call today, Michael Bongiorni. And you know, it's a complete 100-degree change in my feeling of isolation, at least so far. You know, there's a lot of things that still need to be addressed, but it's just amazing to have that comradeship as a roommate that I haven't had in years. So just wanted to share that with everybody. Great to see everybody.
Great, thanks.
Nicholas, go ahead.
Hey, everybody. Nice to see all of you. I would like to out myself, Dr. Gover, as one of your clients. And it's been my goal also to fight stigma on so many different levels. And so I just want to thank you. And one of the things I've been doing for self-care, I decided at the beginning of the pandemic that I could either gain a lot of weight or really be focused on getting healthier. And I've actually lost almost 40 pounds in the last 7.5 months by working with a nutritionist every week, reinforcing new behaviors with my therapists. And I've also been focusing on ways I can continue to be of service in my well-known role as a media activist. I don't want to take up too much time, but I will say that a couple of months before the pandemic, I made a decision to unfriend all 4,000 people on my personal Facebook profile with the intent of going out into the real world to organically and authentically connect with real people in a natural, unfolding way. And then the pandemic happened. And I will say that I've missed in many ways the connection that I had there on Facebook, but the result is that I was able to stay away from all of the angst that was going on in that environment about everything that's happening in our world, and really just be focused on my creativity and my well-being and being of service. I will say that I could not have done it at all without the resources afforded to me through Desert AIDS Project. And I know that the representatives in our room today that are with other service organizations are equally as important in all of this. I'll wrap up by saying I would love for the healthcare providers at some point today to talk about contingencies if the Affordable Care Act should be overturned. I personally have some anxiety around that, but thank you for letting me share, and thank you for being of service.
Thanks, Nicholas.
Anybody else? Go ahead and raise your hand, either using the function or just go like that. And don't be shy, we're among friends.
Any questions or comments on my presentation?
Well, this is Jeff, and I'll share a little personally. Am I echoing?
A little bit.
Yeah, just so people know, we are kind of have a, oh good, the sound is off. We're all gathered, or some of us at least, who are kind of moderating the program are all at the Annenberg in one big social, physically distanced room. So that's why there's sometimes some echoing if the room audio is on. But yeah, I want to share that COVID has really triggered for me some PTSD from the early days of the HIV pandemic. You know, it's eerily similar, and of course it's a deadly disease. It's scary. We don't know what it is, and I'll talk a little bit more later about how people shared that. You know, for those of us who are long-term HIV survivors, it's kind of deja vu all over again, and we knew what to do to keep ourselves safe. But there's the whole psychological aspect that Dr. G was talking about, and the most uncanny thing for me has been the similarities in the political situation. You know, we had a very uncaring administration then as now with Reagan, who would not even say the word AIDS for 7 years after more than 10,000 people had died. And people were being ostracized. There was a lot of controversy and stigma, not unlike what we're experiencing today. So I think for me, that's been kind of the biggest challenge. And I literally turned off my, cut the cable to my TV, stopped, put myself on a news diet, and tried not to obsess about what was happening, because it literally is crazy making. And I don't know if others have experienced that, but that's been the biggest thing for me. I keep very busy. COVID has me busier than ever, you know, kind of finding ways for Heart PS and other groups in the Valley to band together and respond to it. But, you know, there's no controlling the political environment we're forced to live in right now. It just makes everything so much worse.
I think it's so important to recognize what sphere of influence you have control over.
David, I see your hand is up. Let me unmute you. Go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Dr. G. Thank you so much for your presentation. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to thank you so much for your presentation and all your helpful tips. I want to let you know that I took screenshots of all your slides so that I can share them with friends that were not able to participate this morning. And I don't really consider myself isolated. I do have a partner, and we're excellent support for each other. But one thing that I just wanted to mention, because I'm an animal lover and I'm a dog lover, and I think for people that are truly isolated and living by themselves and don't have a lot of social interaction, if you have the ability to rescue a cat, a dog, an animal, to give you some sense of responsibility of something to have to take care of, I know that it's brought a multitude of wonderful things into my life, and I just wanted to throw that suggestion out there as well as somebody put their dog up on the screen.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for mentioning that, Stephen, because there's actually quite a bit of research that shows that having an animal, a pet, will actually boost your immune system,
Right.
and you will generate oxytocin, which is very good for you, and general well-being occurs, not to mention the psychological boost of having someone to be responsible for, to care for, and who loves us unconditionally, right? So that's absolutely very, very important. It's one of those self-care strategies that are very work. It's great.
Yeah, this is Jeff again. Two of us have our dogs here today. Ivan, you can see on the screen, and Chris has his dog there as well. So
yes, I see the cat there. Yeah, everybody's showing their pets. That's wonderful. Yes. Yay! That's terrific.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Gover, you were making a point a moment ago before that question. Do you remember what that was?
Oh, yes. Well, I was just responding to what Jeff had said about, it's important to have what I call an information news diet, where you limit how much exposure you have to distressing news, because if you become a news junkie and you're just kind of addicted to the news and it's making you increasingly more anxious, it's important to limit your exposure, right? But the point I was making is that there are spheres of influence, and we need to identify that which we have control over, and which is all the things that I cited in the presentation. These are things we can do to overcome loneliness and social isolation. These are things that we have control over. And then we have to accept, radical acceptance, that which we have no control over, and recognizing that that's a sphere that we have no influence in, it's out of our control. We need to let go. We have to release with love and let go, because we don't have any control over the outcome. And with anxiety, oftentimes we get caught up with worrying about things that are outside of our control, and that's a hypothetical worry that just causes us unnecessary distress.
All right, Jeff, do we have any other questions at this point from anyone in our audience? You can either put it in the chat, or you can physically raise your hand if you'd like to be recognized. And Dr. Gover, while we're waiting for any questions, I wondered if it might be easy to go back to some of those tips that you had shared earlier. I know we are going to share some of the PowerPoint slides, that the whole presentation, the video, will be available on the HARP PS YouTube channel when we've completed today. But some of those tips, I know were, you had the list of various things that we can do. Mm-hmm. And because we've got a little extra time here, I wonder if it might be good to share some of those again, if it's not too much trouble, because maybe people could take.
Sure. I see that there's been a
we do
bunch
have
of
one
people in
person.
We do have
chat.
a question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me unmute Bill Kavanaugh.
All right.
Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. And thank you, Dr. Gover, so much. Everything you said was so important, because so many people are suffering from isolation right now. But I do want to say that as a therapist, the increase that I'm seeing most in my practice is not with individuals, but with couples who are suffering through the pandemic together, and learning to, not what they argue about, but how they argue and how to live together through this.
Yes, you raised a very important point, and I'm so glad you said that, because my first suggestion is to improve communication skills. But one thing that's emerging from this is, because so many people are staying home a lot more, working from home, couples are not getting the breaks that they used to get before COVID, where they would go off to work. There's a lot more strain on couple relationships, and a lot of issues that are coming up for couples that need to be addressed. And of course, therapy can help, as we know, right? And we definitely need to acknowledge that it's a stressful time, and therefore there's sort of an uptick in issues that come up for couples.
And a related question to that is, what about people who aren't currently in relationships, and how do you navigate dating or just finding that physical connection that, so many of us, it's an important part of our lives?
Absolutely. And I know Bridget's going to talk more about that later on today, but it's definitely more challenging, because we have sort of new layer added on that before engaging in physical contact, right, of any sort, we have to really trust that that person is going to be part of our bubble, right, in order to stay safe. So dating has to be much more mindful and with thoughtfulness, and it's going to be more challenging to meet people. People aren't going to just, sort of like Nicholas said, organically, naturally, spontaneously connect the way they might have before COVID. But it doesn't mean that it won't happen. And engaging in groups and activities and events is how you do meet people.
Well, and again, it takes us back to the early days of the HIV pandemic, when there was so much anxiety and fear around sex, and people had to navigate how they could have safer sex once again. So we're kind of back where we started.
Yeah, and like you said, Jeff, there's so many eerie similarities and parallels, particularly psychologically, that it's bringing up a lot of very painful memories for a lot of long-term survivors.
That said, having lived through that, we're very resilient, and we have coping strategies. We wouldn't be here if we didn't. So
that's right.
If we did it before, we can do it again.
Yes, and this time around we have technology, which we didn't have before. So.
Yeah, we used to curse technology because we thought it separated people, and now with the pandemic, it's actually what's keeping us connected.
Yes, connected. Yes, that's an irony, isn't it? Is there? I saw some chats. Did you want to read what people wrote in the chat? Can you pull that?
So Mark shares that for him, living in a rural part of Tennessee, isolation is a problem that he deals with every day, and now it is amplified.
Right, exactly. And now it's just amplified. Right. But this loneliness and social isolation has been an issue for a very, very long time. But like you said, yes, it's just everything's worse now.
And Nicholas shared that he doesn't currently have anyone in his bubble, and it has been lonely.
Mm-hmm.
So thanks, Nicholas.
And that's the difference between emotional loneliness versus social loneliness.
And can you elaborate on that? How do you connect those two? How do you make those two come together? Well,
there are different types of loneliness, and so they require different interventions. So if it's an emotional loneliness, it's around missing an intimate connection, and that doesn't require a lot of people. That requires just one person, where you feel like the connection is intimate and deep, and typically when people have an emotional loneliness, it's because they're wanting a partner, right, a romantic partner. But
I know.
social loneliness is a little different. Social loneliness is when you just need to work on expanding your social network of friends and
Can we get the
acquaintances.
Hamilton back?
Are we still on?
Yeah,
So
we're still on.
yeah, so that's the difference.
So someone writes, I really appreciate this conversation, Dr. Gover. How does being an introvert fare in the social isolation? Is it less than extroverts? I do crave being social, but I love my alone time too because of my hobbies.
That is such a great question. I'm so glad somebody raised that because I forgot to mention that. It's very, very interesting. And there's a book, this person who asked this question might be interested in reading The Introvert Advantage. It has a premise in the book that introverts are just as healthy as extroverts. And I think this is very important to acknowledge because in our society, extroverts are rewarded and introverts are always sort of looked at as if they're like somehow there's something wrong with them, right? Because they aren't as social, right? But there's been an ironic twist with COVID that introverts tend to be faring better during this pandemic because they like being alone. And a lot of introverts have gravitated towards occupations that allow them to work alone. So a lot of them already were working at home, right? And so their lives weren't turned upside down in quite the same way as those of us who are extroverts. And the difference between an introvert and an extrovert, if I'll say very quickly, is that the introvert gets drained around people and they need to be alone to replenish and kind of build up their battery, right? And the extrovert is recharged around people. And when they're alone, their battery drains out, right? So you can see how for extroverts, this would be a much more challenging time because they're not getting their fix of being around other people. And they have to do it in this on a not virtual way, not in a way that feels quite as satisfying, right? Whereas introverts probably find a certain amount of safety from the distancing that technology creates, and they have less experience of stress and anxiety than extroverts. So thank you for raising that. It is interesting.
And then some of us are extroverted introverts, where we need kind of a balance of both, and that's of course thrown out of whack because you don't,
Yes.
you know.
Yes. And here's something else that's very interesting as we age. Our energy level, of course, speaking to the choir here, everybody knows this, who's an older adult, that we don't have the same energy that we had when we were 20. And so we have to be very judicious in how we expend our energy. And if we're extroverts, we want to spend a certain percentage of our time engaging other people, but we also need time to just relax, right? Because we can't maintain energy at the same level that we used to when we were younger. So we're not going to run from party to party to party to party because we don't have the energy to do that. Even though as extroverts we might really enjoy that, right? Right. So yeah, it's finding that balance. And right now it's very challenging because everything has to be done through technology, or for the most part, most of it, for us to be safe. The safest way, of course, is to remain physically distanced. But as I said several times, and I want to just keep emphasizing this because I think it's so important, we need to make a distinction in our minds between physical distance and social isolation. And just because you're physically distant does not mean that you have to be socially isolated. You can still cultivate connection, which is what we all need to be doing right now to stay healthy.
Great. wonderful words to end on, unless we have any other questions. Jeff Taylor, anything else that you've seen in the chat, or we?
No, I don't
right.
see anybody else want to raise your hand. I see Bob. Yeah, go ahead.
Bob.
Bob, you need to unmute.
Bob is, you need to unmute.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I already printed out the daily quarantine questions. I found it also very interesting to see the breakdown of isolated, friend-centered, and integrated loneliness.
Yeah.
And realize that some of the people who are in my friend-centered group are not people with whom I feel intimately or really connected. And it kind of puts a strain on that rather superficial relationship where I'm asking more from it than those people are able to give. And the more I've become integrated through, especially Zoom calls, example is today, and hearing and listening and asking, the better I have felt. And I want to thank Jeff and Christopher and others that I've met through these calls, Brad, and just say it works. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That's really wonderful to hear. And yes, I hope everybody will think about that and think about ways to create a spectrum of relationships so that you fall in the integrated category as much as possible.
That's great. Dr. Gover, thank you so much for sharing with us today and bringing this, these wonderful tools and this great information to us. A lot of things to think about. I know, again, that I just want to reiterate that we will be sharing the video of this, and I believe we'll be able to get copies of the presentation as well to share around to everyone today. So we've got just about 5 or 6 minutes before our next presentation, and I